Welcome to Book Banter, classic and modern reads, where every page sparks a conversation. Here, we dive into timeless classics and today's best-selling novels, bringing thoughtful discussions, reviews, and reflections on the stories that shape us. Whether you're revisiting an old favorite or discovering a new book, we're here to explore the characters, themes, and timeless truths within every page. So, grab your favorite book, settle in, and don't forget to subscribe for more engaging conversations with us. Let's get started.
Ever wake up from a dream kind of shaken and think, whoa, that could be a book? Well, Mary Shelley didn't just think it, she lived it. That crazy, vivid nightmare she had, the one with the scientist and his seriously creepy creation. Yeah, well, that's the spark that turned into Frankenstein.
And it wasn't just, any dream. It was one of those, unsettling waking dreams, the kind that really stick with you.
Yeah, those are the worst.
I know, right? And the image Shelley described, the scientist kneeling beside his creation, but it's not joy. It's sheer horror. Man, that's powerful stuff.
For sure.
It speaks to this fear that was very real back then. What if the things we create, what if they become our undoing?
Especially when your inner circle is Lord Byron and the doctor who basically invented vampires in literature. Can you imagine trying to outdo those guys in a ghost story contest?
Oh, talk about pressure.
Right. No pressure, Mary. Just, change the face of horror forever.
It makes you wonder if that kind of competitive energy, if that fed into the story's themes, because here you have this young Mary Shelley, right? She's already dealing with the loss of her own mother during childbirth, and now she's navigating, the joys and anxieties of being a mom in a time when, infant mortality was tragically common.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that today, but back then, losing a child, it was a terrifyingly real possibility.
Absolutely.
In fact, Shelley herself, she had this recurring dream after her first child died, a dream where the baby came back to life.
Wow. See, that question, that what if my child came back to life?
Yeah.
Thing. It's like this unspoken current running beneath the surface of Frankenstein.
It's
about this miracle of creation, but also the heavy responsibility, the potential for things to go very, very wrong.
Yeah, it's like that saying, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. And in Shelley's time, that wasn't just a figure of speech. Science was making all these huge leaps forward. The line between life and death, what's natural, what's even possible, it was all kind of blurry in a way it hadn't been before.
Totally. And one of the things that makes Frankenstein so fascinating, even today, is how deeply it's rooted in all those scientific debates of its time.
Yeah.
Take the concept of the sublime, for example.
Okay, the sublime. I feel like that gets thrown around a lot.
It does. And it's not just about pretty scenery, although the novel, it's got plenty of that.
Yeah.
The sublime, it's this idea that nature can be both totally awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time, like when Victor's up in the Alps, right?
Okay.
He's surrounded by this breathtaking scenery, but he's also on edge. It's almost like the mountains themselves are watching him.
It's that feeling you get when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and you're drawn to the beauty of it, but also terrified of falling. It's no coincidence that Victor's big, fateful encounter with his creation happens in that setting. So how does this whole sublime thing tie into the science of the story?
Well, imagine believing, as many scientists did back then, that there's this mysterious life force, this vitalism that animates all living things.
All right.
And then imagine thinking that you could, harness that force, maybe even recreate it in a lab.
Whoa, that's a pretty heady idea.
Right.
You're not just studying nature anymore. You're trying to, control it. Maybe even become a god yourself.
Exactly.
No wonder Victor gets into trouble.
Exactly. He crosses a line,
Yeah.
From simply observing nature to, trying to manipulate it. And there are always consequences. Shelley seems to be warning us about the dangers of unchecked ambition, letting our reach exceed our grasp,
It's like that old saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And boy, does Victor learn that the hard way. Speaking of pushing boundaries, one thing that really struck me while I was reading was how Shelley tackles the role of women in the novel. Or actually, maybe more like their lack of agency.
Interesting.
They're often portrayed as, pure and innocent, but also pretty helpless. What's going on there?
It's subtle, but Shelley is definitely using those portrayals to critique the limitations placed on women back then.
Yeah.
Remember, this was a time when women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, expected to be wives and mothers, not like intellectuals or adventurers.
So by giving these female characters these kind of limited voices, she's actually making a bigger statement about how women's voices were silenced in society as a whole.
Precisely. And it's not just about giving them a voice, it's about the consequences of not listening to them. Think about Justine, falsely accused of murder. Her side of the story, it's totally ignored, and the result is tragic. Or even Elizabeth, Victor's love. She's ultimately a victim of his ambition, a pawn in this larger game she doesn't even understand.
It's almost like Shelley is saying that when women's perspectives are excluded, when their voices are silenced, everyone suffers.
Everyone.
And that's a message that sadly still resonates centuries later. But let's shift gears a bit here. One of the things that surprised me while reading was just how much real science Shelley managed to weave into the story.
That's one of the things that makes Frankenstein so enduring. Remember, this was published in 1818. This wasn't just some spooky fantasy. Shelley was engaging with like the cutting-edge scientific debates of her time.
Such as?
Well, for example, there was this concept called vitalism. This idea that there's like this mysterious life force, something beyond just the purely physical, that animates living beings.
Okay.
And guess what? This wasn't just fringe science. One of its proponents was Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin.
Wow, okay. So we're talking about a renowned scientist, a physician, a poet, a true figure of the Enlightenment. You're telling me that this idea of like sparking life into inanimate matter, it wasn't just the stuff of like crazy scientists in Gothic novels, it was being debated in like prestigious scientific circles.
Absolutely. And this is where Shelley's genius really shines through. She takes these real scientific concepts and she uses them to explore the ethical implications of scientific advancement. She asks, just because we can potentially manipulate the building blocks of life, should we?
It's almost like she's like looking centuries into the future, anticipating the kinds of debates we're having today about like genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. It's mind-blowing how a novel written over 200 years ago can still feel so relevant to our lives today.
And that relevance, that ability to speak to our deepest fears and aspirations, is precisely why Frankenstein continues to fascinate and challenge readers today.
It's like she's holding up a mirror to our own scientific progress, right? And asking, like, are we creating our own monsters? Speaking of monsters, I think it's time we talked about the creature himself, because when you really dig into the text, he's a lot more complex, even sympathetic, than the big lumbering brute you usually see in like movies and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about Frankenstein is this idea that the creature is just like born evil.
Right.
But that's not how Shelley portrays him at all.
Yeah.
In those early chapters. He's like a child almost.
Yeah.
Curious, eager to learn, just desperate for like some kind of connection.
Yeah.
He even teaches himself to read.
It is heartbreaking when you think about it. Abandoned by his creator, like thrust into a world that just doesn't get him. He's the ultimate outsider.
Totally.
And then his first experiences with humanity, it's all rejection. It's all fear.
Yeah.
It's no wonder he becomes so bitter and vengeful.
And here again, I think we see these echoes of Shelley's own life. The creature's like longing to be accepted, his rage at being abandoned. It mirrors a lot of the emotional turmoil she went through as a young woman.
You're talking about her relationship with her stepmother. That was pretty rough.
Exactly. After Mary Wollstonecraft died, her father married Mary Jane Clairmont. And she already had like kids of her own. And by all accounts, their relationship was strained, to say the least.
Yeah.
Very often felt like a total outsider in her own home.
So she understood what it felt like to be the other, to really want that love and acceptance, but instead just be met with like suspicion or even hostility. It's like she poured that very real lived experience into the creature's story.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the creature's first act of violence, the burning of the DeLacy cottage, it doesn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
It's a direct response to that family's like horrified rejection of him. They fixate on his monstrous exterior,
The surface.
Yeah, and they're totally blind to any potential for good within him.
It makes you think about like how we judge other people, you know? Based on just appearances, how quick we are to label someone as good or bad without really seeing them. like really seeing them.
It's a powerful message, and it's so relevant even now, right?
Totally.
Like centuries later.
Yeah.
And that's the real tragedy of the creature, isn't it? He's not inherently monstrous, but he becomes that way because of how he's treated by society. He's a product of nurture, not nature.
That's that classic question, right? Like, are we born who we are, or do our experiences kind of like mold us, shape us?
Right.
And in the creature's case, it seems like it's a bit of both. He has this capacity for good, this yearning for connection, but it gets twisted
It does.
by all the rejection and cruelty he encounters.
It gets twisted, it gets warped, and that's what makes Frankenstein so compelling, so enduring. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
To ask ourselves if we too are capable of creating monsters through our actions, our prejudices, our fears.
So it's not just a cautionary tale about like science gone wrong. It's a cautionary tale about like human nature itself.
Exactly.
We like to think of ourselves as rational,
Right.
as these evolved beings, but how often do we let our fear, our prejudice just cloud our judgment?
It's a question that's as relevant today as it was in Shelley's time. Think about all the ways in which we other those who are different from us, whether it's based on race, religion, sexual orientation, or even just how they look.
Right.
Are we repeating the same mistakes that Victor and society make with the creature? Are we capable of recognizing the humanity in those who seem different?
Yeah.
Or are we just destined to keep creating monsters out of our fear?
It's a chilling thought.
It is.
And I think it speaks to that enduring power of Frankenstein. It's not just a story. It's a reflection of us. It's a warning, and we would do well to heed it.
And that brings us to perhaps the most important question of all, right? What is Frankenstein telling us about our own time?
Yeah.
About the choices we're facing now as we grapple with these ever-advancing frontiers of science and technology.
It's like she's peering into the future, right?
Yeah.
Seeing the potential for incredible progress, but also like devastating consequences. It's not just like science fiction anymore, is it? We're living in a world where like gene editing, artificial intelligence, even the idea of, creating life in a lab, it's not just like plot points anymore. It's headlines,
It's everywhere you look.
It really makes you wonder if Shelley was like really onto something with that whole playing God theme.
It definitely gives you pause, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because the questions she was asking back then, they feel even more urgent now.
Totally.
Take the Human Genome Project, for example. We've mapped the building blocks of life. But what are the ethical implications of that knowledge? Can we really get rid of all disease, but without risking some crazy unintended consequences?
Right.
And what about AI? Like creating machines that can think for themselves. Are we opening Pandora's box just like Victor did?
It's that double-edged sort of progress, right? The potential for good it's huge, obviously, but so is the potential for something to go very, very wrong. And sometimes it feels like we're so busy, so caught up in the excitement of discovering something new that we forget to ask those tough questions until it's too late.
And that's exactly where Frankenstein is so valuable, I think. It reminds us that even with the best intentions in the world, things can still go wrong. Victor, he was brilliant, but he was blinded by his own ambition, and he didn't stop to consider what might happen. Not really. Not until it was too late.
It's like that saying, it's easy to create a monster, but it's a lot harder to love and care for one.
That's good. Yeah.
And in a way, that's really what Frankenstein is all about, isn't it? Like both Victor and his creation, they could have loved, they wanted connection, but they were both denied that basic human need.
And that brings us back to the question we started with.
Yeah.
Right? What does Frankenstein tell us about ourselves, about who we are? I think it reminds us that we all have the capacity for both. For creation and destruction, for love and fear. And that the choices we make, especially when it comes to these powerful new technologies, those choices will determine what our future looks like.
So it's not just about like what we create in the lab, right? It's about who we are as human beings.
Exactly. We were not careful. We could end up creating a world that's haunted by the monsters of our own making.
And that's a future no one wants. Well, on that cheery note, I think we've just about reached the end of our deep dive into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Time flies. when you're dissecting classic literature.
Right, it does. But seriously, this book, it's more than just a horror story, right?
It's a timeless exploration of what it means to be human in a world where the lines between creation and destruction, right and wrong, are becoming increasingly blurred.
And it asks us to consider the consequences of our actions, not just for ourselves, but for everyone and for generations to come. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out Frankenstein. And be sure to join us next time when we'll be back with another deep dive into the world of literature.
Thanks for joining us on Book Banter, Classic and Modern Reads. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you love this conversation, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into both classic literature and today's must-read books. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what book you'd love to see next. We release new episodes every week, so stay tuned for more. Until next time, happy reading.